pose. Oh, good to know. So thanks, Chris, first of all, for writing it. And I'd like to hand over to you really to introduce it, tell us what the motivations were for writing this, what it really goes into, give people a bit of a flavour if they haven't read it already, and what you think the purpose of it is for Stop the War members and activists to use to take away and to inform their activity. And then I'll let you do that, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. So if comrades in the room want to have a think about any questions that they might have, then do that, and we'll have a chance for that, a bit of a discussion after Chris has introduced the pamphlet. So Chris, thanks again, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Shelley, for those kind words, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with the pamphlet was to look at the current debates partly through the kind of prism of what's happened with the media and politicians and the mainstream in previous wars. And wars are moments of kind of great opportunity for governments and for generals and arms manufacturers and so forth. But they're also times of great risk, precisely because wars are so brutal, they're so destructive, for that matter, they're so expensive. There's always the danger that people will turn against them, and that can be very devastating to a state that's engaged in war. In fact, British Prime Minister Lloyd George actually said during the First World War, actually said to the editor of The Guardian at the time, if people really knew the truth, this war would stop tomorrow. And this is why it is the fact that disinformation, that propaganda, that lies tend to peak in wartime. And it's also why wars are so often presented as being in some kind of simple and humanitarian terms, very often as being fought for the freedom of foreign peoples. So it was said Britain entered the First World War to defend poor little Belgium. The first US-UK invasion of Iraq in 1990 was justified as liberating Kuwait. When we were involved in bombing Libya into the dust in 2011, it was to defend the people of Benghazi, and so on and so on. And now, once again, we are being told that an enormous war effort, an absolutely massive war effort, is being fought by the Western powers or supported by the Western powers for kind of altruistic reasons, for humanitarian reasons. And of course, we're in the unpleasant position where in the mainstream politics and in mainstream media, there is a virtual consensus behind the war, in support of the war. And this is quite shocking in a way, because backing this consensus does involve signing up to the idea that the people that brought us the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and the terrible bombings of Syria and Libya, that these people have suddenly become champions of the rights of nations to self-determination. And it also means believing that it's a good idea to pump billions and billions of pounds of deadly munitions and armament into a stalemated war that looks, insofar as you get a sense of what is really going on the ground, which is not very much, but when you do get an insight, looks horribly like World War One, in that it's bogged down in vicious trench warfare. And it's a war that has already cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. And it's also, it means believing, to sign up to this consensus, that this is a good thing for the Ukrainian people. Now, the aim of the pamphlet, I guess, is to kind of try and inject a bit of critical thinking into the discussion about the war, but also, as I say, to remind people of the way that governments and military do lie and deceive in wartime. I think, Russia did start this phase of the war with their brutal invasion back in February last year. And that was an invasion that, as you all know, the anti-war movement opposes or opposed and continues to oppose Russian occupation. And that has made it easier, I think, for the Western powers to present this as a justified, as a defensive war. But there has also been a massive propaganda operation around the war. And first of all, I mean, the skepticism and analysis that the media at least sometimes deploys about other countries' foreign policy is completely suspended when it comes to what our own government is doing, when it comes to what the Western governments are doing more generally. Given the recent history of Western interventions, the idea that the US has spent around $64 billion on aid and military aid to Ukraine, that is an absolutely huge amount of money. It's 40% of the amount of money that was spent across Europe in real terms for the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. The idea that the US has spent that amount of money simply to defend Ukrainians' right of self-determination is a stretch of the imagination, to put it mildly. And the fact is that senior US figures, including the president himself, including Biden himself, have made statements that reveal quite clearly that what is behind the effort is not humanitarianism, is not a concern about the plight of the Ukrainians, but is actually a desire to put maximum pressure on the Russian regime, if possible, to deliver regime change, but at the very least, to massively weaken a country, a government that the US regards as being one of its main regional competitors. And, you know, Joe Biden actually said this in an interview just after the war started back in March last year. And when asked to retract, when someone said, "Are you saying it's a war for regime change?" he said, "I'm not rolling back on anything I've said." So, you know, it wouldn't be hard for journalists to construct a bit more of a critical view if they wanted to. But I think one of the big aims with the whole operation is to bury the background of the war, to actually make it kind of taboo to even examine and even question the causes, or for that matter, the consequences of the war. I mean, you would think, for example, that the fact that NATO has pushed over 1,000 miles eastward since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right up to Russia's borders, you'd think that that would at least be a part of the debate about why this war has happened, but it simply isn't. And one of the things I point to as well is that there's an absolute chasm between what is said in internal documents, in strategic documents produced by Washington and to some extent in the British defence community, and what they say most of the time in public. And the most clear example of this is that a whole string of senior US political figures, from Madeleine Albright to Henry Kissinger, including the current head of the CIA, actually William J. Burns, have warned in writing that the expansion of NATO eastward would almost inevitably lead to confrontation with Russia. Essentially, they've been making the same argument as we make about the causes of the war. But in public, this is completely ignored, and in the media, this is not part of the discussion. In fact, after freedom, one of the sort of keywords, one of the buzzwords of the warmongers is the word unprovoked. It's quite interesting. Look out for it. Biden's first speech on the war in February last year had the word in the title. Antony Blinken's Secretary of State's immediate response also had the word in the title. A few months later, Jeffrey Sachs calculated that just one media outlet in the US, the New York Times, had used the word unprovoked 26 times about the war, in 5 editorials, 14 opinion columns by in-house journalists, and 7 guest op-eds. So, you know, they obviously know that this is a key part of what they need to do, is to bury any sense that there's any historical geopolitical cause of this war, that the West has anything to do with provoking it. This contradiction, of course, is completely ignored. I mean, you'd think, again, this was something that halfway decent journalists might pick up on and might want to ask questions about. But actually, just raising it as a point of discussion leads you to being denounced as a Putin apologist. And this is another aspect of the situation that I talk about, the way in which dissent is demonized and even attacked and intimidated. I mean, it only takes a minute to check the fact that the Stop the War Coalition has always had no to the Russian invasion on every single bit of our leaflets and propaganda and posters and so on and so forth. But They don't do that, and they don't do that because they know it's a lie, to be honest. Um, and so this is another unfortunate aspect of the situation. They really don't want to debate, and there is a major operation going on to suppress debate and to intimidate anyone who dissents. Um, it's always part of the way that the establishment responds in times of war. There's a long history of it. But as far as I know, this is the first time in history, in the Labour Party's history, that opposing a foreign war has become an expellable offence. And there's a whole number of other aspects to this operation, including people chasing protesters and including actually meeting venues being called up and threatened when we have try and put anti-war meetings on. Now, I think this aspect of the situation is a product of the fact that they know that in actual open debate over time, they will lose the arguments. They know despite the massive efforts right across the media and across the political spectrum, they haven't managed to generate much enthusiasm for the war. And despite all the propaganda, at least a quarter of the population, according to polls, basically agree with the position that the anti-war movement is taking. So that's why it's so important that people are not intimidated, that we defy Keir Starmer or anyone else who tries to stifle the debate, and that we put the arguments as clearly and as calmly and as with as much energy as we can across the country, in the unions, on the streets, and in the communities. The position of the anti-war movement is not complicated, and it definitely shouldn't be controversial. The fact of the matter is that there's already doubts emerging in the Western camp about whether the war can be won, because the Ukrainian offensive, counter-offensive, has had very, very little impact. The war will almost certainly end in negotiations. The truth is neither side can win. We just want the pointless killing to stop now before hundreds of thousands more people are killed and maimed. And I think it's really urgent that we do get this argument out and that we redouble our efforts in the autumn to make this argument. And hopefully this pamphlet is a useful contribution to that effort.
Thanks, Chris. And I think it certainly is. Thanks for that introduction. I just want to ask you a few questions myself, and then we'll invite others to come in. So, comrades, please do raise your hand if you've got something you want to say. But also, if you don't want to kind of ask your question on screen, feel free to drop me a message in the chat. You can message me directly, and I can also read that out if you'd rather, if you're feeling a little bit shy. Okay, so Chris, you talk a lot about what we're seeing now has kind of been played out previously, particularly you talk about in the pamphlet with the war in Iraq, the kind of the Hitlerization of the enemy, the demonization of anti-imperialists, this burying the historical context of the war. And it seems like this is maybe being done to an even greater extent now. Is that the case? Is, you know, having been involved in the anti-war movement for so long, can you kind of say, is the media even less critical than in previous wars that Britain has been involved with right now?
I mean, there's a lot of continuity. You know, the Hitler example is a case in point. Milosevic, Mullah Omar of Afghanistan, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Assad of Syria, Gaddafi, the president of Libya, all of them had the kind of Hitler tag at the time. You know, it's an absolute classic, and it's useful for all sorts of reasons. It's referring to the Second World War is handy because it's the only war really that carries a kind of legitimacy in the popular imagination. So I think that's part of the reason they do it. Also, it's useful to call these people Hitler, because then anyone who criticizes the war is immediately, by definition, an appeaser. So that works as well. But actually, I mean, in all these cases, including the case of Putin, it's a complete historical travesty. The fact of the matter is that Germany was the second most powerful military in the world. It was the most powerful in Europe. Hitler was openly, and the regime was openly engaged in an attempt to occupy the whole of the Eurasian landmass. I mean, that was part of the of the even the propaganda, and of course, in the process, they unleashed an industrial scale genocide against not just Jews but communists, socialists, gays, gypsies, and a whole number of other groups. Now, Putin is a horrible authoritarian who is engaged in a battle to maintain control of a region outside of Russia that he thinks he should control. But, there's no comparison. Russia has 1.3% of world GDP. It's a relatively minor power economically and even militarily. So, I mean, these things are designed to blind us really as to the reality of the situation. I mean, I think we are, on the other hand, in a different situation from Iraq because there was more open opposition over Iraq. That's the truth. There were lots of Labour MPs who were prepared to speak out against it. There was even some elements of the establishment who were concerned about it. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that, as I say, the fact that Russia kick-started this phase of the war with the invasion has made it much easier to present it as a progressive war. I also think the fact that the start of the war coincided with the defeat of the left inside the Labour Party around Corbyn has created conditions in which it's harder to build the opposition. I think that's part of it as well. I also think, a proxy war is an easy war to fight from the Western powers' point of view because they don't have to put boots on the ground. There's no danger of there being casualties, and that's a massive advantage from the point of view of the Western powers. So I think there's both similarities and those important differences that do make it harder for us, a harder call for us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. And something else I wanted to get you to expand on a little bit is you mentioned in the pamphlet, and most of us will be aware, there is a massive opposition actually to the war in the global south, both from the governments leading those countries, but also from the wider populations. Why is that level of opposition kind of able to manifest there, and why is it so much less so the case here?
I think this is largely because of the legacy of the wars that the West has fought in the last 20 years plus. I mean, I think Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the support for the Saudis in Yemen, I think all of these things have alienated millions of people in what is called, the global south, because they've experienced the sharp end of what it's like to be attacked by the West. They know what it means. They know the misery. They know the carnage. They know the suffering that is created. So I think that's the main reason. I think there are other reasons, which is that, funnily enough, Western or US hegemony around the world is on the wane, precisely, or at least partly, because of the defeats in Iraq and in Afghanistan and the disasters in the other countries. There is, and also obviously the rise of China economically, and to a much lesser extent various other powers in the global south, has meant that the kind of unipolar moment is slipping away. The moment of Western power when the US was the world's policeman, unchallenged, and so on and so forth. That moment is slipping away from the US, and I think those two things combine to create that dissidence in the global south. But I also think, by the way, this makes it a very, very dangerous moment, because the moment when a power that has been used to having its own way across pretty much the whole of the globe for decades, the moment when that power is challenged is a moment when that power is potentially extremely dangerous. And I think this explains the virulence and the enthusiasm with which Biden is backing the war in Ukraine.
Thanks, Chris. Final thing that I wanted to ask is a bit about the restrictions on reporting. So there's a line here towards the end where you say, if either the real motivations or the brutal reality of war was widely understood, popular support for most wars would crumble. And then you say that governments place draconian restrictions on war reporting. Can you say a bit more about what those restrictions kind of are and what they look like?
Well, I mean, this is something that has developed in the West since the Vietnam War, because the kind of US governments and the establishment, they blamed the media for undermining support for the Vietnam War, which, you know, had maybe an element of truth to it. And journalists were allowed to roam around the battlefield in that particular war. And ever since then, there's been different attempts to control what journalists can and can't do. And obviously, recently, there's been, in the Western wars, there's been this thing of embedding journalists. The only way nowadays that Western journalists can get to the front of wars is by being, you know, in a tank, in a unit, dressed in military fatigues, answering to the commander of that particular unit. And so that has a big effect on the way things are reported and the extent to which things are reported, and that's been quite a useful operation. In Ukraine, there's a massive level of control over which journalists are allowed to the war front, both Ukrainian and international journalists. And there's been, in fact, if anyone wants to check it out, there's been complaints by the Ukrainian Journalists Union about loads of journalists who have asked questions about the way the war is being conducted, not even actually opposing the war, but just, you know, being a bit curious about various aspects of it, who haven't been allowed to go to the front. And if you think about it, although we're getting lots of reports from war-damaged cities that have been bombed by Russia out of Ukraine, have you seen any footage of the actual fighting on the front line? I've seen very, very little. There was a couple of reports that I wrote an article about, actually, that came out earlier this year around the battle for Bakhmut, which were they were in the Ukrainian media, in sort of alternative Ukrainian media, and they were absolutely shocking. I mean, it was almost unreadable, just the carnage that's going on, and constant reference to the First World War as a kind of as a point of reference for the type of fighting that's taking place, the minefields, the trenches, the fact that, you know, people fight for weeks just to move forward 10 meters or 100 meters, you know, and with a huge casualty rate, and lots of people on both sides deserting, actually. So when you do get an insight into what's going on, you can understand why they're clamping down on press freedoms.
It's horrific to see and to read about. Okay, I have got one question in the chat from Andy, and anyone else on the call, please do raise your hand or post in the chat to me if you've got anything you would like to ask. But first of all, Andy asks Chris, why is this never compared to the Cuban crisis in reverse? The delivery of weapons to the Russian border is much more significant than the 2 missiles on the Soviet boat going to Cuba. I have now got a hand up from Michael Spencer. Michael, do you want to come on screen and ask your question?
Yes, hello. Sorry, I can't. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, we just can't.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm trying to fiddle around here with it. I may not get myself on screen, but anyway, yeah. I just wanted to Chris, thank you very much, by the way, for coming, and I did enjoy the pamphlet. I found it very informative and useful. You know, what I was going to say was I just wanted to touch on the sort of the other arguments that others in the left come out with, you know, with because one thing I often hear argued is, for example, you know, this is like what about the Spanish Civil War? What's the difference between, because obviously you know, these people have been invaded, self-determination and so on. There's a sort of use of, like you say, they use the Hitler thing, but they also use other conflicts, don't they? Like say, oh, it's like Afghanistan, it's like Spanish Civil War, it's this, it's that. I mean, what would you say specifically, for example, to those who say, well, what about those socialists who supported those who fought in the Spanish Civil War? That kind of argument. What is the best way, do you think, to argue against that sort of thing?
Great question. Thanks a lot, Michael. And Duncan in Edinburgh, can I bring you in next, please?
Yeah, thank you. A great discussion, and I'm looking forward to reading the pamphlet. My question is, we hear that opposition parties within Ukraine have been banned and other measures taken against them. Is that correct? And is there any kind of move within the peace movement within Ukraine to challenge the government openly now or not? Or has that been suppressed? Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. I think that question kind of touches on maybe part of the answer to Michael's question. But Chris, is that enough for you to get going with those three questions? And then if people have got any other thoughts, please do raise your hand in the meantime.
Yeah, thanks for those. On the question about Cuba, I mean, yeah, it's a fair point. You know, if anyone was looking for historical analogies, that would be one that is, at least in some respects, quite pertinent. And I think the reason it's not raised is because it would be quite a devastating indictment of the general approach that is being taken by the West. There is one bit of research I did read, funny enough, I think it was published in Harper's magazine in the US, where a couple of researchers asked a load of Washington defense insiders how they would respond if China was putting its warships in a Mexican port, you know, armed with, you know, missiles and so on and so forth. And they did a load of interviews, and all of them said, well, obviously this would be an incredibly provocative move, which would likely lead to, first of all, an immediate international crisis, and second, possibly military action. And that's, you know, that's really a very simple thought experiment, and it's hard to think that's not absolutely true. So, yeah, I mean, the lack of imagination, the lack of kind of you know, any sort of critical thinking about what is going on is really quite shocking in right across the establishment, right across the media, including, and in some ways it's at its worst in the liberal media, in the BBC and the Guardian, which, you know, I mean, the Guardian is frothing at the mouth for more weapons, for more arms, you know, and anyone who questions, who talks about context, is condemned as talking about whatifery and whataboutery, you know, i.e., let's try and understand this situation in a historical context. On the Spanish Civil War, I mean, you know, if you're going to make analogies, they need to be appropriate. They need to have some reference to the situation that you are comparing with. And, you know, the situation in the Spanish Civil War is completely different. It was a war which was basically a domestic conflict between the left, the workers' movement, the democratic forces on the one hand, and fascist reaction on the other hand. That is a completely different situation from the situation in Ukraine, which has been invaded by a foreign power and whose government is now signed up to and engaging with the biggest military alliance in the world. I mean, famously, the left in the Spanish Civil War got almost no support from outside of Spain. They got no support from Britain. They got no support from the Western powers. Because they didn't like their politics. They didn't like the fact that they were basically socialists or anarchists, and certainly progressives. That's a completely different situation from the one in Ukraine, where you have, you know, as I say, you have a government-led military operation, which is embedded, not just supported by, but embedded by NATO, in NATO, in the world's most aggressive, powerful military machine. So, you know, it's a ridiculous analogy to make. On the political parties, yeah, I mean, it's true. There has been, and I do write about it in the pamphlet, that Zelensky has banned, but very early on, just weeks after the war started, he banned basically a whole range of left-wing parties in Ukraine, on the grounds that they were pro-Russian, which definitely some of them weren't. And not only that, but he's instituted massive legislation to curb the freedom of trade unions, including taking all the trade unions' property off them and introducing, by the way, a whole series of kind of neoliberal economic policies and deregulation policies that he tried to introduce before the war started, but he's actually used the war as an opportunity to implement. So yeah, I mean, the idea this is a war for freedom when you've got a viciously authoritarian government clamping down on freedom of speech for journalists, clamping down on trade union rights, banning political parties. Again, it's ludicrous, and it is really shocking that sections of the left have gotten themselves so muddled up that they are, supporting this regime. I mean, it's a subsidiary question what they're doing internally, but it's still an important one. It's one we should point out.
Thanks, Chris. I did wonder if you were alluding to the Spanish Civil War comparisons, where you say this is on page 6. The massive levels of aid being pumped into the region, mostly military, is of course not being provided to a popular movement, but to a state war machine run by an authoritarian government in conditions of martial law. And then you go on to talk about all the ways in which Zelensky is obviously cracking down on unions and so on. Was that what you were maybe perhaps alluding to there?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Ross, please, if you'd like to come on screen.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the talk. I saw a comment from John Rees on Twitter yesterday, and he was making the point about the right-wing Republican base in America actually calling for anti-war message. So like, what do you think are like the dangers of us ceding ground to the right on this if they actually take on our arguments and build their base on that?
Thanks for that, Ross. Do we have anyone else wishing to ask the question? Do just put your hand up. I don't see anybody in the chat with a hand up or waving their hand on screen. Of course, you can also drop me a line in the chat. Oh, I do see another hand now. I see Pedro. If you'd like to go ahead, Pedro. We can hear you.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to apologize for my poor English. I'm Pedro Pinto Leite, the Secretary of the International Platform of Jurists for East Timor. And since Timor-Leste is free, we are working for Western Sahara, as it is a question very, very similar to the one of Timor-Leste. Since already 2 years, the war between Polisario and Morocco has resumed. In fact, the United States, France, Spain, and Israel are helping Morocco to keep the illegal occupation of most of the territory of Western Sahara. The Western countries are pointing to the illegality of Russia's occupation of Ukraine, but they don't do anything about Morocco. Can you comment on this hypocrisy from the Western countries, please?
Thanks for that, Pedro. And I can see Ian's got a thumbs up. Ian, I'm not sure if you're meaning to put your hand up or if you're just agreeing with Pedro's point there. Just agreeing with Pedro's point. Okay, well that's absolutely fine. We love a little bit of crowd participation. Okay, just before I bring you back in, Chris, can I just plug to everybody, if you haven't got a copy of the pamphlet, then you can pick up a copy on our website, and you can see in the chat there the link to do so. And I would also like to say, if anybody's feeling generous, we have a appeal at the moment. We're trying to get as many donations as we can to help fund Stop the War's work, so that we can keep demonstrating, keep hosting meetings all over the country, keep our local groups going and our national activity alive. We do rely on the generosity of our supporters and our membership subscriptions and everything. So if you are able to donate towards that, that would be much appreciated. And you'll find the link to that in the chat as well. But Chris, if I could bring you in there in response to those two questions, please.
Yeah, thank you. On Ross's point, I mean, I think this is a very, very serious problem. That where the left is not putting a strong case against the war, and where it's not, visible and cutting through and people aren't aware of it, where there isn't a strong sort of progressive anti-war movement, the danger is very much that it becomes an issue that the right starts to instrumentalize to build its power. And obviously this is a big danger in the United States at the moment. The fact is the Republicans stopped the bill going through last week for further aid to Ukraine. Trump, at least rhetorically, says that he thinks this war is disastrous and that we shouldn't be waging it. And it's not just in the US. This week there was an election result in Slovakia in which the far right got a very, very good result, a far right organization. And one of the main platforms of that election campaign was precisely to be against the war in Ukraine. Now, this is a very, very dangerous situation because the war's only going to get worse. Working people turning against it. I think in general, opinion is moving across Europe at different speeds. I think opinion is gathering pace against the war. I think even here, anti-war feeling is growing. And for this mood not to be being articulated by the left is really disastrous. And I mean, even worse, if the left becomes associated with supporting the war, with actually being in favor of the war. One of the things I haven't talked about, but is very, very important, is that the fact of the matter is that the increased military budgets that are being pumped up because of the war in Ukraine are contributing to the cuts. They're contributing to austerity. Every pound or every dollar that is spent on the war isn't going to be spent on wages, isn't going to be spent on welfare, isn't going to be spent on hospitals, isn't going to be spent on schools. And that's an ABC argument that the left is really needs to be putting and really needs to be arguing as part of any attempt to gain ground and to relate to the mood of working people. So yeah, I think this is a very, very serious question, and it's one of the main reasons why it's very important that the anti-war movement is, that we really push back against the votes that took place at the TUC. We push back against the fact that Labour MPs are refusing to oppose the war, and that we do it with some urgency and energy. I think the question about hypocrisy is also a crucial question. I didn't have time to raise it, but the points that you make about Morocco are absolutely right. Time after time, there's such rank hypocrisy about these questions that, again, I know the media is pro-war, I know the media is biased, but it's quite extraordinary to me. For example, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is visiting Britain. He's going to be given a red carpet Rishi Sunak welcome to Britain next weekend or the week after next. How does that square with the idea that we're fighting a war in Ukraine for freedom, for democracy, for national self-determination and so on and so forth? Saudi Arabia is one of the most brutal regimes on the planet. Regular executions of dissidents and opponents and so forth. So, and that's just one example. There are plenty more, like the ones you mentioned. The idea that the West and that NATO is engaged on a mission to defend civilized values, to defend the rule of law and so on and so forth around the world is an absolute joke. I mean, even NATO, Poland is a member of NATO. The UN say Poland's not a democracy. Turkey is a member of NATO. The UN say Turkey is an authoritarian state and not a serious democracy. You know, the case is very, very weak. It's feeble. But the problem is there are not enough people examining it. There are not enough people taking it on, challenging it. And we all need to start doing this. And we all need to start doing it quite urgently, because we need to take down this argument. I mean, part of the reason actually why we need to take it down is because, of course, behind the war on Russia is the kind of spectre of the much even more frightening conflict with China, that is looming as a serious possibility. And, you know, we're going to see the same propaganda assault around that war, or in a potential war. We're going to see the same kind of civilizational discourse being unrolled about freedom of, you know, Taiwanese freedom, about human rights in China, and so forth. We've got to be able to counter those. We've got to counter them in a sophisticated way. We mustn't get locked into a situation where we look as if we're supporting Russia or China, because we're not. What we're saying is this kind of militarism, this kind of escalation, this kind of brinkmanship is desperately dangerous for the whole of humanity. That's the point we need to make. And if we make it loud and clear, I think we'll get a very good hearing.
Thanks, Chris. I've got a few in the chat and a couple that want to come in on screen. We've got a bit of time left, so it'd be great if we could get all of these in. So first of all, from Sharaya, apart from Stop the War, what other established groups and academics are seeing through the propaganda? What percentage, do you get a sense what percentage of the population might be able to think critically about Ukraine? I've got another one from Mariam here, who says, please mention Yuri Shelly Asquith, who of course you know, Executive Secretary of the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement, recently arrested for so-called pro-Russian propaganda. And I've got another one from Chris here, who asks, what about the fear of Lithuania and Estonia? What about the fear that they have of invasion if Ukraine were to lose the war? Okay, and if you've managed to take a note of those, I can always ask them again, but I've also got Andrew and John who'd like to come on the screen. Andrew, would you like to ask your question first?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, good, yeah. Well, I've posted a few comments, but here's one that I will put in. It appears that the left and most of the anti-war pulling their punches, but the US right, as we've already discussed, has say no war, and I don't believe this. US forces are nothing like as strong as they seem on paper. I say I don't believe this. I think the US forces are very strong. Anyway, that was one of my questions, and I'll leave it at that.
Interesting. Okay, thank you, Andrew. And John.
Yeah, you know, I think one side of the argument, and I think Chris has dealt with it very effectively, is the way in which the propaganda machine works and the content of what it's saying. But I also think it's worth asking ourselves, what effect is it actually having? Because otherwise you fall in a kind of lazy way, I think, into believing that it kind of dominates people's thoughts. And, you know, in the sort of Facebook language, that there's, you know, a few of us who can see through the lies, but the sheeple out there, they're all taken in by it. But if you actually look at the opinion poll evidence, it's a much, much more divided opinion on the war than that. And I think the most important thing to say about this is we aren't at war. You know, there are no British troops or none in substantial numbers fighting in Ukraine. No American troops, no NATO troops. Part of the disgusting nature of the war is that they're arming Ukrainians to do the fighting and dying on behalf of the NATO powers. But the fact that we aren't at war makes a difference to what the opinion polls say. You see, 66% of people in this country are opposed to us sending any troops whatsoever to the Ukraine. So in one dimension, the population is resolutely anti-war if that means us actually doing any fighting. And that's a very important thing to say, because what's left then, what they are supporting, and people in this country, about a third against, but two-thirds in favour of sanctions and supplying arms. And that's an argument that we want to win, but we're starting far further forward than you would think if you imagined that that was a wholly and committed pro-war stance. It's not. It's a kind of, okay, if they're fighting, we'll help them. If they were invaded, we'll help them, which is a different kind, more complex actually argument than we had in the case of Iraq or Afghanistan. And in some ways, a more important argument, because this is a conflict which is raising the issue not of a colonial war between the great powers and minor powers like Iraq and Afghanistan, but of a conflict between major powers. So it's not a war, but it is a proxy war, and there's a lot at stake in it. So it makes the argument a little bit more complex and a little bit more important in some ways. But I don't think that we should imagine that we're quite as far back as you would do if you thought this is just a straight pro-war majority in the country.
Thanks for that, John. And actually, that statistic about 66% of people don't kind of want us to send troops into Ukraine is quite helpful in answering one of the other questions. But I wonder how many of those people realise that we do indeed have special forces there. Chris, can I invite you back in to respond to those questions and thoughts, please?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll come on to the opinion thing at the end. That's a very interesting and important discussion. I mean, just on Yuri Shelly Asquith, who's an anti-war pacifist activist in Ukraine that people will probably have heard speak at numerous Zoom meetings. A very brave guy. I mean, it tells you something about the situation in Ukraine that he is now under house arrest. Apparently for being pro-Russian, which is presumably should be his right, but anyway, is not something that is in any way applicable to him. And there's nothing he said that even implies that. So this tells you what kind of a regime the Ukrainian regime is. This tells you the kind of government that Zelensky is running, and I think it's very important that we extend, maximum support both to Yuri and also to Boris Kagarlitsky, who's in prison in Russia because he's speaking out against the Russian war machine. And the Stop the War conference last month, it actually passed a resolution sending support and solidarity to both of these people. I think we need to keep doing that. On the question of Lithuania and Latvia, I mean, obviously there is kind of historical concerns about Russia in the Baltic region. In a way, that's understandable historically, but I think this is why our analysis of what is actually going on and the real dynamic behind the war is so important, and why we have to understand, as I said, many of the leading people in US foreign policy circles admit, internally or privately, that the invasion of Ukraine last year was provoked by this strategy, this conscious strategy of the eastward expansion of NATO over decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, it's not the case that Russia invaded in the 90s or in the early 2000s. It is a response to a particular conjuncture. And I mean, in the end of the day, we support the Russian anti-war movement, and we see the Russian anti-war movement as the source of the potential to control Russian aggression in the future. But I think it is worth bearing in mind what Anatol Lieven, the Russian expert who used to be in Britain, is now living in the US, what he said about the situation, which is that about the kind of military balance between Russia and NATO and the surrounding countries. He says a Russian army which has had to fight for months to capture relatively small cities in the Donbass hardly looks capable of capturing Warsaw, let alone Berlin or other capital cities in the region. Now, you know, I don't want to downplay the risk, but there is truth to that. You have to look at the real situation. And this is one in which you have a weakened, an economically weakened state, a military which really hasn't shown itself capable of being particularly effective. You know, we need a peace process. That's what we need in order to deal with this situation. Finally, just on the question of public opinion, and I think the points that John made are very, very important. There's a constant danger of confusing and conflating what is being discussed in Parliament, or the kind of discussions that are taking place in Parliament and on the media, with public opinion more broadly. And I mean, this is a danger right across the board, to be honest, because it's happening. We have on the one hand this consensus, this pro-war consensus, basically in the mainstream, but it's happening at a time when there's a gulf in public opinion terms between Westminster and the rest of the country. You know, it's almost a cliche when people talk about it that people are absolutely alienated and angry at what the elites are doing, at the kind of, you know, the establishment and the Westminster bubble. So, you know, the two things are very, very different. And that's why it's important, as John said, to look at the opinion polls and to be clear about the fact that there would be opposition to any kind of, there would still be massive opposition to putting boots on the ground. But there is actually a very significant and quite impressive body of, you know, opinion that is critical of what is happening anyway, that is critical of the sanctions, that is critical of the spending on war, that is critical of pumping the weapons in as well. And that's the basis on which we can, you know, we can build a real movement. And, you know, it's not just about engaging with the opinion polls, it's also about actually engaging with those people and actually finding those people and trying to, you know, to provide them with the arguments they need, but also get them to organize alongside us. And this is very important. We don't want to be stuck on, you know, in Zoom meetings, or that important though they are, obviously. And we don't want to be just, you know, keyboard warriors. We have to be out on the streets. We have to be in our union branches. We have to be in our workplaces. One of the things that Stop the War is doing, and this relates directly to public opinions, we've got a call for peace, that a new call for peace in Ukraine, relating to the fact that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has stalled, and that even in Washington now there's significant sections who are thinking, you know, we can't pursue this anymore. So we put out a call for peace, which is calling for negotiations, just very simply putting the argument. We've got 50 prominent figures who have signed up to it. We're going to release that probably tomorrow, you know, publicly release it. And we want people to sign up to it. We want people to take it into their work. We want people to get their friends, you know, anyone they know who they think might be open to listening to it, to read the argument, to sign up if possible, and circulate it as widely as possible. So, you know, it's very much about saying, we can make a difference to this situation. It's not that we're an embattled minority. It's not that, you know, no one agrees with us. And particularly on the economic questions, there's massive support for what we're saying. The point is, we've got to get that support organised. We've got to relate to it.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And I think that's a really great point to kind of end on, is that we need to get out there. We need to speak to people. We need to convince more of them of these arguments. And I think this pamphlet is really handy in that task ahead that we have in winning people over and making those arguments and being confident in them as well. So please do get a copy if you haven't already. You can get that on the website. Please do donate if you are able to our winter appeal. And if you're not already a member of Stop the War, then please consider joining us, because we do need as many people involved in the coming fights ahead as possible. And it's always great to connect and see you at the future actions and meetings. I think the kind of note that you end the pamphlet on, Chris, is a really good one to end a meeting on it. Because if you say, as the world becomes more dangerous, we must be more active. We absolutely must. So anything that you can do, whether it's taking part in a protest over the next year, whether it's donating to our appeal, whether it's joining Stop the War, whether it's affiliating your union branch, or taking a motion or the peace pledge into your workplace, your local Labour Party, your local whatever it may be, all action counts and helps further the anti-war movement, and in particular the arguments against this particular war and Britain's involvement in it. Thank you everybody for joining this evening and taking some time out of your evening. I hope you can go away and enjoy your dinner now. And thanks most of all, Chris, to you for writing the pamphlet and for giving your time to talk about it. And engaging so thoughtfully with those questions and comments from people. Thanks everyone who got involved and shared your thoughts and questions there. And I hope to see you all again online or in person soon. Until next time, comrades.
Thanks, Shelley.
Good night all.